Alright, so today I've got another video in my Heidegger concept series. I've done a couple of videos on some early parts of Division 1, but I never got into Division 2 in my concept series. Now there's a couple reasons for that. Part of it is that, obviously I just wasn't through it at the time, but Division 2 is significantly more difficult, especially what Heidegger has to say about temporality. I'm still not exactly sure what he means by temporality. I have some clues and maybe I'll do a video on that in the future after some further study. But his talks on death are quite interesting, and as kind of a forerunner in existentialism, death is a very important part of his project. And today I want us to see, what does Heidegger have to say about death? Now, the way Heidegger sees it, death is actually something very important that we can use to orient our lives better. He thinks that a big problem with the Seinsfrage, the question of being, is that we haven't properly understood our nature, which is to be oriented towards death. So we're going to talk about some different parts of death that he talks about and what exactly that might mean, because you really have to be careful with Heidegger, because it's easy to read him on a very surface level and not really understand exactly how deep he wants to go. But he wants to show how death is actually an existential possibility that allows for all other possibilities as such, which we'll explain exactly what that means in a second. Now, starting on page 288, this is page 244 in the German, he gives us an interesting analogy about the ripened fruit. And what he's trying to establish here is that being is always incomplete. He says, the ripening fruit, however, not only is not indifferent to its unripeness as something other than itself, but it is that unripeness as it ripens. The not yet has already been included in the very being of the fruit, not as some random characteristic, but as something constitutive. Correspondingly, as long as any Dasein is, it too is already its not yet. Now, there's a lot of important spots to kind of talk about here. We have, we can call this kind of how death is constituted for identity. And the way he sees it, there is a now, and there's a not yet. So there's an identity of things that I am right now and certain things that I would like to be in the future. Lacan would say that this is kind of how desire works. Desire always points outside of oneself. And the way Heidegger sees it, when we think about a fruit that is ripening and it starts as this green fruit, and someday it's going to become a ripened fruit. And we tend to think that the future is not something that is. And of course, this gets into a lot of questions about time. But the now is usually what we think of when we think of identity. And that there is just a sequence of nows that go to the not yet. But, and this is something that you would actually get if you read Hegel, but the not yet is actually part of this fruit's identity. A fruit, one of the ways that it is defined is that it has a life cycle, that it is always going forward somewhere. And Heidegger wants to show that this life cycle, or what philosophers like to call becoming, this is actually an essential part of being that death is going to help us ground, because we have not only ourselves now, but we have a complete picture of ourselves as a life cycle or as something that is changing. And this is kind of when Heraclitus is, and this is a great example that I like, but he has the idea of a river. And a river is always flowing. And the question is, we have a river at some point, and we have a river at a second point. And we can say this is point A, and this is point B. And this is time. So any river has certain properties about it, and we could say that it has an identity. We could talk about the fact that it has a bank that goes along the outside that gives it a definite shape, and we might use this in geography to talk about the difference between rivers. But not only is there shape, but there's the size. There's also composition. What kind of material characteristics are there in the river? The salinity of the water. And then we could also, we could talk about a bunch of other things that make up the river. And one of the important things is the water. And if we think about it, the water is always flowing. And if we come to another point in time B and look at this river, the question is it the same? And if so, by what right? Because there is a specific identity of the river here. And if we look at anything in the river, it has changed. The temperature has probably changed as the time of day has changed. And so has the position of every single molecule of water in this river. So it seems that there is some sort of transcendent identity, and that doesn't mean anything divine or anything like that. It just means that there's something non-material that gives us reason to assume these are the same thing across time. In the same sense here, the now and the not yet are both constitutive for what it means to be anything. And these have to be taken together if we want to understand what it means to be the river or to be a fruit. And Heraclitus' point, and you might see some of this if you watch my Heraclitus video, but it's inherent in the definition of a river that it is constantly changing. It's a flowing body of water. And we have no problem attaching to the very identity of something precisely that it has no single identity, but rather has different identities across time. And this is something really important that Heidegger wants to talk about, which is that change, which, this change will culminate in death, as we like to think of it. Death might actually be a very useful boundary for how we're talking about identity. Now, another important part about death for Heidegger is just how central it is to our way of life or our way of being. It's not simply something that happens at the end, but just like the ripening of the fruit, it's always something that it is approaching and something that it faces up against. He says on page 289, or this is page 245 in Heidegger's German, on the contrary, just as Dasein is already its not yet, and it is its not yet constantly as long as it is already its end too. The ending which we have in view when we speak of death does not signify Dasein's being at an end, zu Enden sein. zu Ende sein, sorry. But a being towards the end, sein zum Ende, of this entity. Death is a way to be, which Dasein takes over as soon as it is. As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die. And this sounds very macabre, but but Heidegger is very interested in death as a way of life or a way of being. That death is something we're not only familiar with, but that we have to orient ourselves towards. And just in the same way that this fruit is always moving towards some points. You know, we like to think that the fruit has some beginning point, and this is the start, and then we like to think it has some end over here. And in between, we've got a bunch of different forms. It might get big, then it might shrivel a little bit into a tiny little thing, and then it dies. And we like to think that death is the end. But an important thing, and this is kind of our analogy to the human, is that we've always got an I. This is some person who is always looking towards their end and sees it as a way not only of something that they're coming to, but a way to relate itself to all its different points in time. So end or death is not something destructive, but in fact, it's retroactive. It is retroactive. It is constitutive. It makes sense of all this other stuff. If we just have all these different points in time, and they, in the same sense as the river, they have some sort of identity. At this point, you know, the size of this dot and the size of this dot, on their own, we have no reason to suppose that they have anything in common. Sure, they're both dots, but they're not the same dot. They're not the same thing. But in the case with the river, we understand that even though there's some change, we have some idea of identity which transcends the individual material natures of the object. And what Heidegger wants to state is exactly how important death is for providing that transcendence to each individual identity. The fact that one is always old enough to die as soon as they are born not only points to death as something that we should be afraid of, but something that if we learn to face it properly is going to make sense of all these individual moments. Now, moving on, Heidegger, and he kind of foreshadows this, we're moving ahead a few pages to page 294, or page 250 and 251 of the German, where he wants to talk about death as the ultimate possibility, or the possibility of impossibility. It's a sort of totalizing thing that really makes sense of identity as such. He says, death is a possibility of being which Dasein itself has to take over in every case. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its own most potentiality for being. This is a possibility in which the issue is nothing less than Dasein's being in the world. Its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. And we'll kind of break this down a little bit because the vocabulary he uses is actually quite important. But it's important to realize that death is essentially a possibility for Heidegger and for all of us. It's a way of orienting oneself. So I have me, at some point in time, and then time goes this way, and I've got a number of things that I could become. And the question is, how do I make sense of this? This is very ambiguous, and Heidegger has gone through a lot of existential analysis before, almost 300 pages into the book, to mention a couple important points about this state. He says that the fallen, or falling into this position, is inherent, and it's not only falling, we could say falling, but it's Geworfenheit, which is thrownness. So when I am here at any point in my being, I am fallen into what I am in. And fallen not in like the fall, like Christian kind of sense, but fallen as in I have fell into this moment, and Heidegger specifically talks about falling into a clearing, but I have fallen into a way of being where I have an identity, and then I have a very ambiguous future. And this creates a number of things. One of the most important things is angst, or anxiety, or angst is kind of that's how you would say it in English, and we have the same word. But falling into this state and being very confused about the future, we not only have to be here, but we are thrown into the fact that we have to find some way to orient ourselves. And Heidegger says that if we want to make sense of this mysteriousness, we have to make sense of possibility. And for Heidegger, death is the ultimate possibility. Death is our way of making sense of all of this stuff that's going on. Now, Heidegger uses two important words here in this phrase where he says, its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. And this is a big, long compound word. It's no longer, and then being able to be there. And here he uses a very big, long word that we're going to have to spell out here. He says, nicht mehr da sein könnens. Nicht mehr da sein könnens. And that has been translated as the possibility of no longer being able to be there. Now, if we piece this apart, he's using two different words here. We have sein können, and we have another one, nicht mehr da sein. And sein können is potentiality for being. So this could be something like our possibility here. So death is, of course, this is expanding upon death. Nicht mehr da sein könnens. And it's a possibility, of course, but it's also no longer Dasein. And this is a really important part of death. And this is why we're scared of it. It's no longer Dasein, in the sense that I have myself here, and in the future, maybe, I don't know, maybe I lost an arm. Oh no. happen to my arm? And in the sense that death, of course, is a way of thinking about possibilities, of orienting oneself towards possibilities. And there is the fact that one is always no longer oneself as time progresses on. And no longer Dasein, here it's like, okay, yeah, I'm still Dasein. But, of course, the question is, one day, I will be not me anymore. I'll be gone. And of course, this might seem fairly complex as a way to talk about this, but death is essentially the most important possibility because it's the possibility that orients us towards our other possibilities, that makes sense of these, of the fact that we are always moving forward, and death is something that is going to, this state right here is essentially the same as this unknown, of what could happen here in this unknown. And typically, we become shocked. And when he's talking about Das Man, and you should watch my video on Das Man if you kind of need some more background on this, but this is the kind of amorphous social mass that we are oriented towards in our lives. And Das Man is always afraid of death because it is nicht mehr Dasein. And moving forward, Heidegger is going to talk about how do we come to terms with that. Now, as a way to give this some more existential weight and to explain exactly how death works existentially, because what Heidegger is interested in is the way death is experienced, because experience is a very important part of phenomenology, and he thinks that if we want to understand the world, which is known through experience, we need to understand ourselves, which is known through experience. But and if you see my Dasein video, you'll see how he sees Dasein, or being there, or being the there, or the there being of what it is to be us, which is essentially to have our own Daseinness in question, our own being in question. Essentially, we are both near our being, it makes a lot of sense to us, we live through it, but also it is completely elusive and doesn't really make much sense. And that's the paradox that he's kind of trying to deal with. And on page 295, and this is page 251 and 252 of the German, he kind of first highlights what I was talking about. On the contrary, if Dasein exists, it has already been thrown into this possibility. And of course, this is the possibility of death, but we could think of this as being any possibility, that one essentially has to deal with stuff. And this is terribly concerning in one's daily life, because there's all kinds of stuff you just have to deal with. And when you think about death, maybe you're someone who's thinking about ending their life prematurely. You've got all this stuff that's going wrong that you just have to deal with. And it's like, why do I have to deal with this? Why can't I just be in some blissful world? And this is kind of one of Heidegger's most important things to talk about, which is exactly our existential state of Verfallen and Geworfenheit. But he goes on to talk about Angst, anxiety, the way that we feel towards death. He says anxiety in the face of death is anxiety in the face of that potentiality for being which is one's own most non-relational and not to be outstripped. That in the face of which one has anxiety is being in the world itself. And he goes on to say, factically, Dasein is always dying as long as it exists. But proximately, and for the most part, it does so by way of falling. Now, there's a lot of scary stuff that's going on here. He's talking about the anxiety and death. It's something which is one's own most, and this is kind of an important part of death. And he's gone through these one at a time before, but I'm just kind of going straight to the meat of it. But death has a couple properties. First, it is one's own most. It is non-relational, and it is not to be outstripped. What exactly does that mean? We gotta go through each of these on their own. One's own most, this probably makes the most sense, that death is something which one has to deal with on one's own. No one can help you make sense of death, in a sense, because everyone is all equally struggling with death. And this is very Hobbesian, that we're all facing death and we're trying to do what we can to escape it or find some way to preserve ourselves. So Heidegger is super critical of that. And he's like, the problem, and this, in a sense, is probably where we have Hobbes, who says that life is death and struggle. And if we want to understand how to make a good society, we have to come to grips with this fact, that life is essentially death. And Heidegger would agree in certain ways. He even said earlier, practically, Dasein is dying so long as it exists. Now, the important thing here is that Heidegger does not say that life is death, but that it is dying. And this might sound quite confusing, but these two are not the same thing. Dying is a process. Death is an end result, something that has already been reached, or some sort of outer bound that's going to make sense of our life. But Heidegger is very important to say that we are always in a process of dying. And it's not like we're kind of dying, but our being is literally always dying. Not in the sense that maybe it's like always spiraling down and always degrading, but in the sense that it's always changing and it's always going through from one moment to the next. Even if you see oneself in a mirror, myself here and the self that I see in the mirror, and the colors here are important. These two essentially have different properties. These are not the same thing. One might be tempted to say, and this is, you should really look at Lacan's mirror stage if you want to kind of see some interesting ideas using the same analogy. But the important part is that we are tempted to see ourselves as some sort of outside object, as something that has universality, but ultimately we are faced with the fact that our identity is always dying, always being taken outside of us, and thus not our own. He would say that we are in a terrible predicament, and this kind of harkens back to the not yet being, the kind of always being towards a not yet. We're always being towards something that is outside of ourselves, and in that sense, we are always thrown into dying, thrown into eternal change that's going to confuse us. But this own mostness is the fact that, and this is where Heidegger might contend with Hobbes, is that this idea that we have to, because Hobbes doesn't attach a value judgment to this. He doesn't say this is bad. This is just how things are. But Heidegger says that if we really want to understand this, we have to recognize that death is something that is mine. And it's not something that anyone can do anything about, and it's something that I have to come to grips with myself. not simply as an end goal, but as something that is always happening to me. And Hobbes and Heidegger would both share a sort of pessimism in this sense. But the second idea of death being non-relational is quite a bit more confusing. What he means by non-relational is that it essentially cuts one off from people by the fact that it is something that forces one into one's own identity, in the sense that when I am faced with my own death, I am faced with certain facts about my own life, about my age and my history, and where I think my death is going to go, and how satisfied with am I with death, or what age do I want to be when I want to die, or do I want to die at all? These are all very particular questions, and in a sense, the non-relationality of death harkens back to the fact that it's one's own most. That to properly understand death is to understand death as not being able to be extended to anyone else. That, I have two people here. I've got person A and person B. And for person A, death is intriguing. Maybe it's something you want to learn more about through, anthropology or something like that. Or it's something that you're not really worried about. And this person is cool to die at 55 years old. They're like, you know what? Doesn't really matter. It's something that doesn't really give me much existential dread. Whereas this person thinks death is all-encompassing and terrifying. I don't even know if I spelled terrifying right, but that's okay. And this person wants to die. How about never? This person doesn't want to die. They don't ever want to die. That scares the crap out of them, that they might have to die one day. And we have two very different ways of thinking about the same concept: death. Clearly, death means very different things to each of these people. And in a sense, the word death is non-relational, because to understand death is to understand my idea of death. It essentially closes one off, and it makes sense of a personal phenomenon that cannot be understood in the same way that it can't be taken by someone else. Someone can't die for me. I have to do it myself, which is both scary and also maybe some kind of heroic, grabbing my chains and taking over my life, and something like that. So death is not only something that I have to deal with, but it's something that only really applies to me when I really fully understand death in all its existential depth. And the third idea of death is not to be outstripped is pretty simple. Basically, Heidegger has said that we are fallen, and he says more specifically, if Dasein exists, it has already been thrown into this possibility. So, death is something that you just have to deal with, and you can't really do anything about that. So, it is not to be outstripped as something that is defining for your identity and your way of life. It's something central to your way of being oriented to the world, is the fact that you will die. And this is something that we kind of see as a sign of maturity is when someone learns to confront death. And this is where the Barbie movie really started to sound like Heidegger to me. Because Barbie's big thing, and this in a sense, we might like to think that this is the difference between childhood and adulthood, is when do you start to grapple with death? Just in the same way as the mirror stage for Lacan, we've got that point where I start to see myself in an outside reflection of myself. Death acts as a reflection of myself very completely. It gives me certain ways in which I must be oriented towards something and towards anything. And this is the important part of death, is that by understanding death, I understand that this is all, and we could probably just put it where this question mark is. This is possibility as such. To understand the way we orient ourselves towards death is to understand exactly what possibility itself is. Possibility is my own most possibility. Possibility applies to my being specifically, or to any one particular being, whether it's the ripened fruit or whatever it is. The possibility of the future of that thing only applies to that thing. And it's also non-relational because possibility is contingent upon the identity that it's talking about. When I talk about the possibility of the future of the fruit, that's very different from talking about the possibility of myself. Even if we can talk about both having life cycles, we're talking about essentially different things. And possibility is not to be outstripped. One does not simply live as a person here in a box. That's not how it works. There is no amorphous cloud of nothing out here. And this is something Heidegger would probably say, that even if we did live in something like this would scare the crap out of us because it's mysterious. And we would start to have anxiety towards it. And essentially, all possibility is not to be outstripped as a possibility as such. We are always going to be faced with the possibility that we have a past and a future. So by understanding death, which is the thing that makes itself present to us the most, we've now made sense of possibility as such. Now, I'm skipping past a bit here, partially because I think it's just a little bit confusing for me to really talk about it and it makes sense to the audience without having read the quite detailed existential analysis that's gone behind this. But on page 308, this is page 264 of the German, he wants to talk about being free for one's death and exactly what this means. And I think if we want to understand what Heidegger and probably people like Hegel too mean by freedom, I think the freedom towards death is the most important and most clear way of understanding what he means by freedom. He says, when by anticipation one becomes free for one's own death, one is liberated from one's lostness in those possibilities which may accidentally thrust themselves upon one. And one is liberated in such a way that for the first time one can authentically understand and choose among the factical possibilities lying ahead of that possibility which is not to be outstripped. Now, this possibility which is not to be outstripped is essentially what death is. But as we just talked about, really all possibility is not to be outstripped. It's essential to identity as such. And the way he sees it, if I have myself at a certain time, and we could say, I think this is number 4, death is a idea of freedom, is that I have myself here, and then I've got this amorphous question cloud, which I'm going towards, and usually we get some anxiety about this, partially because we don't exactly understand what possibility is, because the question is, whatever this becomes, is this me? And we can illustrate this with quite a famous paradox. I've got a ship here, and this is the ship of Theseus. I'm not exactly sure if that's even how you spell it, but this is the ship of Theseus, and it's starting to get old. So I go over here and I replace a board here with a new board. Now, this is for simplicity's sake so that we can understand that the board is new, but let's say that the board still looks the same as the old ship. It's from the same forest. It's from the same species of tree. It's the same darkness, or even if it's not the same, we'd say, well, this is still the same ship. It's still the ship of Theseus. It's just a little different, right? It's got this slight change that we still say isn't detrimental to its identity. It's still the same ship. But the question is, we keep on doing this, and we do this a second time and a third time, and we keep doing this until eventually, and again, this is just kind of to represent that these are new parts, the whole ship is new, in the sense that all the parts are new. Now, to any observer looking at this at any of these points in time, they would probably say that this is still the same. That these little green parts that we add, they change the ship, but there is still always the ship. And this is super important. We've got this idea of a ship, which, as we talked about earlier in the lecture, there's some sort of transcendent identity to the ship, and it maintains its identity seemingly in spite of all of its changes. And this is why the ship of Theseus is called the ship of Theseus paradox, or the paradox of the ship of Theseus. It seems to give us a lot of questions about identity. Is identity material at all? We certainly like to think so, but this gives us a lot of food for thought. And when we take this back to ourselves, we are faced with the same paradox as we are from here in the ship of Theseus. And the question is, I go through all these steps, and eventually I reach some new version of myself. And the question is this me? Now, there's an important element to this, which is that, what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be anything? This right here is the Seinsfrage. The Seinsfrage. The question of being, of what exactly it means to be, and how exactly these things have the same label of human or ship across time. This is a human, more specifically it's me, and this is the ship of Theseus. We've already labeled it. And the question of, is this me, Heidegger says stems from the fact that we don't understand what the Seinsfrage is. We've been going about it the wrong way because we are faced with these different moments which, we've abstracted this into a way where we can understand this is possibility. And these possibilities give us some anxiety. And Heidegger wants to see how can we turn that anxiety into freedom? How can we make it where this state, because we understand that this happens. No one's denying that one is changing from a moment to another. But a lot of the philosophers especially and Heidegger is very keen to really poke the bear here. Like, why? Why are we the same across this time? And Heidegger says that our solution is to turn the anxiety that results from possibility, and thus also from death, how can we turn that into freedom? And his way of looking at this is, of course, to learn how do we talk about death in a way where we understand that this is the possibility of all possibilities. And this needs further elaboration, especially, I would say, in personal study of yours if you're interested in this. But Heidegger says that to be free to one's death, and what he means by freedom is knowledge about death. It's more full than that, but to get a proper understanding of death, to have Verstehen, is to understand what it is to be free, because now one can examine all these possibilities, and I've got a possibility here and a possibility here and another possibility here, and this is all being. This is all being. This is all just different moments of being. And the question is, rather than getting anxious with this of, is this me? Is this me? The way we deal with that is death, precisely because death is no longer being. Hyphens there. Death is the ultimate not being. And in a very Hegelian way, because we have access to being and no longer being, we can now make sense of our different parts of our identity in ways where we can be free to orient ourselves towards ourselves as we authentically are, outside of coercive influences of power that might tell us we want to be such and such a way. This question mark right here can be very influenced by power, such that sometimes they overlap a little, or even completely, such that this image is, it's something in the future, but as of now, it is unknown. It is a not yet. And that not yet can be shaped by influences, such as Das Man, which is an important part of Division 1 of being in time. Now, the question is, if we start to understand this as a continuum of being, and we know that this is a continuum of being because we know what no longer being is, or what death is, now we are free to look at the situation as it is and recognize we have power here, we have Das Man here, influencing what they want us to become, instead of letting us be free to decide it for ourselves. Now, a critically important note, and Heidegger does mention this, is that, in a sense, when we understand death as no longer being, even not being is still understood as a sort of being. And this is the problem with death is the possibility of the impossibility of being. And I think he says that around page 306 and 307. And this is the important part that he's clear to mention just a few pages before. When he says, in this coming close, however, coming close to being as anticipatory and as something that's one's own and whatnot, however, one does not tend towards concernfully making available something actual, but as one comes closer understandingly, the possibility of the possible just becomes greater. The closest closeness which one may have in being towards death as a possibility of this continuum of going this way is as far as possible from anything actual. This is an important part of this whole very complicated mess, and I think all the stuff that's going on the board here almost helps my case. But this no longer being, the only way we can make sense of things is if they are to be. That's an essential property of really being able to conceptualize something. And even death is understood as no longer being. So we are plagued with a problem which we are thrown into and which we have to deal with. And you could say in a big sense, Heidegger had another part of this book that he was going to write, the Division 3 that never came out. And some have said that the Seinsfrage is incomplete because of this. This is essentially all still being. We're always immersed in being. We never actually are non-being. Because to be an are, we are such and such a way, is to always be. So there is a great difficulty with conceptualizing of death that we can see here, which is that death is essentially that possibility which is always impossible for us as a being that is. And as such, we can do lots of stuff to get close to death and understand our factical possibilities, but we are always faced with the fact that we are thrown into it and that we have fallen into this, and that maybe the Seinsfrage is incomplete, or maybe you think it's complete. I would suggest reading all of Being in Time before you say it is incomplete, because maybe you just don't understand it, and I certainly don't myself either. But that's about it for my discussion of Heidegger's conception of death. There's lots more I could have talked about, but this is pretty long, so I want to keep it fairly concise. So I hope you liked this. I hope you might want to learn some more about Heidegger and see why he's so important, and maybe think about how this relates to the Barbie movie or something like that. I don't know. But that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. Please watch some of my other stuff, and I'll see you in another lecture.